They came without warning. No declaration, no ultimatum, just a chemical fog that rolled across every human colony in the galaxy, and billions dropped to their knees without a single shot fired. The Hive Queens called it mercy. They called it order. But somewhere deep inside the stubborn, maddening chaos of the human brain, something refused. If you've ever wondered what it truly means to be human, you're about to find out. Hit like, subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales, and drop a comment telling us, would you have knelt? Now let's step into the darkest and most defiant chapter in human history. The first sign came on a Tuesday. Commander Ethan Briggs was standing on the observation deck of Colony Station Ares 7, a deep space installation orbiting Proxima Centauri b, when the long-range sensors lit up like a Christmas tree in a blackout. 17 contacts. No, 24. The numbers kept climbing. By the time he reached the command bridge, his tactical officer, Lieutenant Derek Walsh, had already gone pale. "Sir," Derek said, his voice carefully flat in that way soldiers use when they are genuinely terrified but refuse to show it. "They're not matching any registered vessel in the Galactic Registry. Not Vorath, not Kale, not Syndicate freighters, nothing." Ethan leaned over the console and stared at the signatures. They were enormous. Each contact was roughly the size of a small moon, moving at a velocity that should have been physically impossible for something with that mass. And they were not decelerating. "Get me Admiral James Caldwell on a secure channel," Ethan said. Now, it took 11 seconds for the channel to connect, and in those 11 seconds, Ethan Briggs had the quiet. Certain feeling that his life, and every human life in the galaxy, was about to change in a way there was no coming back from. Admiral Caldwell's face appeared on the display, and even through the digital compression of a deep space transmission, Ethan could see the gray shadows under his eyes. The Admiral had not slept. That told Ethan everything. "Commander Briggs," Caldwell said, "I assume you're seeing what we're seeing." 41 contacts now, sir," Ethan said, "and still climbing," Caldwell exhaled. 63 colonies are reporting the same. The objects have been tracked since they crossed the outer heliosphere. Our best analysts have had 18 hours. Best guess is a hive formation, but not one we've seen before. The Queens don't usually travel in force like this. They send drones, emissaries. They don't come personally. And that was the detail that lodged itself like a cold spike in Ethan's chest. The Queens themselves. In all the decades since first contact with the Hive Queens of the Velshari Empire, humanity had understood one foundational rule about those ancient, terrifying beings. They never left their core worlds. They ruled through proxies, through their pheromonal network, through chemical signals carried across light years by biological relay organisms that the Velshari had engineered over millions of years of galactic conquest. The Queens did not travel. The Queens did not visit. The Queens sent instructions and species obeyed, and that was the end of it. Except now 63 Queen-class vessels were streaking through human space, and nobody had any idea why. The answer came 4 hours later. It came not through a diplomatic channel, not through a translation matrix. It came through the air itself. The first colonies to experience it were the ones on the outer rim, Frontier Post Kepler, and the mining settlement on GJ 667 CC. The reports were almost identical. People described it as a smell at first, though that was not quite right. It was more like the memory of a smell, something floral and ancient and impossibly deep, like breathing in the exhalation of a forest that had been growing for 1 billion years. It passed through the atmospheric processors without triggering a single hazard alarm. It moved through sealed habitats and pressurized corridors as though the walls did not exist. And then the people just stopped. They did not fall, they did not convulse, they did not scream or fight or run. They simply ceased whatever they were doing and stood very still, and then one by one they lowered themselves to their knees. Miners in full EVA suits, scientists in sterile labs, off-duty soldiers in their quarters, children in habitat classrooms. All of them going down, 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 until their knees touched the floor and their heads bowed, and their hands rested at their sides in perfect, still submission. Station commanders who managed to get a final message out before the chemical fog reached their own lungs described the same thing. No pain, no fear, no resistance. The people who knelt did not look distressed. They looked peaceful. That was the worst part. They looked peaceful. The pheromonal tether, as the Velshari scientists would later explain through their translator units, was a biological masterpiece 300 million years in the making. It targeted the limbic system, the ancient, pre-rational part of the brain that governed fear, submission, and social hierarchy. In every species the queens had ever encountered, that part of the brain was the most powerful part. It overrode conscious thought. It bypassed logic. It reached down into the evolutionary bedrock of any sentient creature and whispered to the oldest, deepest part of their neurology. You are prey, and the apex predator has arrived. And the only correct response is surrender. In 300 million years, it had never failed. In 63 human colonies, across 41 Queen-class vessels and approximately 800 million human beings, it was working perfectly. In one of them, it was not. Ethan Briggs was still standing. He did not know why. He felt it. The chemical signal had definitely reached him. He could feel something pressing against the inside of his skull, like a hand pushing through wet cloth. But instead of the warm, drifting peace that the other survivors later described, Ethan felt something else entirely. He felt pain. White-hot, electric, absolute pain radiating from the base of his skull outward through every nerve in his body. He gripped the edge of the console until his knuckles cracked. He did not kneel. He looked around his bridge. Derek Walsh was on his knees, eyes open and calm. Every officer, every technician, every soldier on the command deck of Ares 7 had gone down. 42 people, and every single one of them was kneeling on the cold metal floor with the quiet serenity of someone who had simply decided there was nothing worth standing up for anymore. Only Ethan was standing. Only Ethan was in agony, and in some part of his mind that was still capable of rational thought beneath the white noise of the pain, one question rose above everything else. Why is it hurting me instead of taking me? He did not have an answer. But he had a terrible feeling that whatever the answer was, it was the most important thing that had ever happened to the human race. And 3 decks below him, unbeknownst to Ethan Briggs, a 26-year-old xenobiologist named Dr. Ryan Cole was crouched behind an overturned lab bench, shaking so hard his teeth were rattling. Also still on his feet, also in agony and scribbling observations onto a data pad with hands that would not stop trembling. Something was wrong with the Queen's plan, something they had never accounted for, and it had just begun. The pain did not fade, it evolved. Over the next 6 hours, Ethan Briggs moved through Ares 7 like a ghost through a cathedral, every corridor silent. Every room populated by the quietly kneeling figures of people he had known for years. He stepped around them carefully. He did not touch them. Some part of him was afraid that if he did, whatever kept him upright would transfer, and he would join them on the floor. He found 11 others on his station who had not knelt. 11 out of a crew of 473. They came to him one by one, drawn to the same place the way desperate people always find each other, the armory. Because the armory had thick walls and a secondary air filtration system and a sealed door. They sat in a loose circle on the weapon racks and crates of ammunition, and every single one of them was experiencing the same thing Ethan was. The pain. The pressure behind the eyes, the burning in the spine, the feeling of something immense and alien pressing against the inside of their skulls and being unable or unwilling to find a purchase. Doctor. Ryan Cole was among them, his data pad still clutched in both hands. His eyes bright with the specific kind of wild focus that only manifests in scientists who have just seen something that breaks every model they have ever built. I need you all to answer a question honestly, Ryan said, before Ethan could even organize a proper headcount. His voice was raw from what sounded like recent screaming. On a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is a mild headache and 10 is the worst pain you have ever experienced in your life, where are you right now? The answers came back. 7, 8, 9, 8. 6, 9, 7, 9, 8, 8. Ryan was nodding rapidly, typing. That tracks. That absolutely tracks. Doctor, Ethan said, keeping his voice steady through the grinding pressure at the base of his skull. What tracks? Ryan looked up. He had the expression of a man who had just discovered he was standing on the edge of a cliff and was not entirely sure whether the next step was a catastrophe or a miracle. The Velshari pheromonal signal is a neurochemical instruction, Ryan said. It's not a gas, it's not a poison. It's a signal like a radio broadcast, but targeted at limbic architecture. In every species it has ever been used on, the limbic system receives the signal and obeys it. Dominant predator present. Submit. And the conscious brain goes along because the limbic system is running the show. But it's not running our show, said Sergeant Marcus Holt, a wide, quiet man from Dallas who looked like he had been carved out of red sandstone, and who was currently pressing 2 fingers against his own temple, as though trying to physically hold his skull together. Correct, Ryan said. Because here is the thing about the human prefrontal cortex that the Velshari did not account for, possibly, because no species in the galaxy has one quite like ours. He turned the data pad around, so they could see the diagram he had been sketching. In most sentient species, the limbic system is architecturally dominant. It's the CEO of the brain, and the rational cortex is a very smart advisor that the CEO occasionally listens to. The limbic system says jump, and the prefrontal cortex says how high. But in humans, Ethan said slowly, beginning to understand. In humans, Ryan said, the prefrontal cortex spent the last 200,000 years in an evolutionary arms race with the limbic system. We are the only species in the known galaxy that has a rational brain that actively overrides, suppresses, and directly conflicts with its own emotional core on a neurological level. We are literally wired for internal conflict. We are the species that feels fear and walks toward the thing that scares us anyway. We feel the urge to surrender, and instead we spit in the face of the thing demanding our submission. He paused. The pain in the room was visible on every face, a kind of shared grimace, and yet none of them were kneeling. For most of our crew, Ryan continued, the limbic system won. The signal hit and they went down, because the human brain, like any other brain, defaults to the path of least resistance. But for some of us, and I suspect it's not random, I suspect it's a specific neurological variation in prefrontal cortex density and connectivity. The rational brain is not just refusing the signal. It's fighting it, and that fight is what we're feeling. We are not immune. We are in open civil war with our own neurology, and so far we're winning. Nobody said anything for a moment. The hum of the station's life support systems filled the silence. Then Marcus Holt said very quietly, "So we're in pain because we're too stubborn to give up." Essentially, Ryan said. Marcus considered this. That tracks, he said. Ethan stood up. The movement cost him, the pressure in his skull spiked savagely, a white-hot lance behind his left eye, but he stood straight and he kept his voice level. All right, he said. There are 11 of us. There are potentially hundreds of others across 63 colonies. The Queens have 800 million people on their knees and they think they've won. He looked around the armory. They haven't won. Because the thing they used to beat us is the thing they don't understand, and we do. Ryan was already nodding. We need to find the others. If we can map the neurological profile of resistance, if we can understand what makes some human brains reject the signal instead of obeying it, we might be able to manufacture that rejection. Synthetically, how long? Ethan asked. Ryan's expression shifted into something that was trying to be optimistic and not entirely succeeding. I have no laboratory, no equipment beyond what's in this armory's medical kit. A data pad with 30% battery remaining. And a splitting headache that feels like a Velshari queen is personally trying to crack my skull open, he said. So longer than we'd like. Can you do it? Ryan picked up the data pad. The light from the screen made the shadows under his eyes look like bruises. Commander Briggs, he said, I am a human being with a prefrontal cortex that is currently telling an alien superpower to go to hell. If that doesn't answer your question, I don't know what does. Ethan almost smiled. Almost, because somewhere above them the Queens were waiting. And they were patient in the way that only truly ancient predators ever learned to be. Certain, unhurried, confident in the mathematics of dominance that had never once failed them. They had no idea that in a sealed armory on a human space station, a man with a headache and a scientist with a dying data pad were about to become the most dangerous things in the galaxy. But they were about to find out. The signal from the Queens came on the 7th day, not through a comm channel, not through any technology humanity had built. It came through the air again, a second wave of the pheromonal broadcast, but this one carried something different inside it. The first wave had been a command: submit. This second wave felt, to the 11 resistant humans on Ares 7, more like a question, a recalibration. As though the Velshari biological network had noticed an anomaly in its data and was reaching back in to check its own readings. "They know," Ryan said, the moment the second wave hit. He was whiter than usual, gripping the edge of his makeshift lab bench with both hands, but his eyes were sharp. "The Queens know some of us didn't go down," the network reported back to them. "They're scanning." Ethan felt the second wave hit him differently than the first. The first had been a hammer. This was a probe, careful, curious, pressing at the edges of his resistance like a finger testing the tensile strength of a membrane. He breathed through it, kept his feet. In the 7 days since the initial submission event, which the surviving resistant humans across the galaxy had already started calling Day Zero. Because there was grim comfort in giving things names, Ryan Cole had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch. He had, however, accomplished something extraordinary. Working with the data pad, the Armory's emergency medical scanner, a collection of salvaged lab equipment retrieved from the station's biology wing in Careful. Painful excursions past hundreds of kneeling crew members, and the willing neural scans of all 11 resistant humans, Ryan had built a model. It was rough, it was incomplete. He had drawn large portions of it by hand on the back of equipment requisition forms, because his data pad had finally died on Day 4, and he'd been forced to charge it in 30-minute intervals from a tool battery. But the model was real, and it was coherent, and when Ethan had looked at it on the morning of Day 6, he had felt something he had not expected to feel: hope. "The resistance pattern isn't random," Ryan had explained, spreading his hand-drawn diagrams across the floor. "It's not even primarily genetic, it's experiential. The humans who didn't kneel, across every colony. Every station I've been able to make contact with, they share a neurological profile that was built by specific kinds of experience." "What kind of experience?" asked Sergeant Holt, who had been running communications for the past 3 days, making contact with other resistant survivors across the network in fragmentary, encrypted bursts. "Sustained, repeated, voluntary confrontation with fear," Ryan said. "Every one of us has a history of choosing, over and over again in our lives, to do the thing that our biology told us not to do. Soldiers who held their ground under fire. Scientists who kept working when every logical alarm was screaming at them to stop. People who went through things that should have broken them and came out the other side not because they stopped feeling the fear, but because they refused to let it make the decision." Marcus Holt said nothing. His jaw was very tight. "The prefrontal cortex is a muscle," Ryan said, "and like any muscle, the ones that get used the most are the strongest. The Queen's signal is designed for brains where the limbic system has never been seriously challenged, where submission is the default, and in most species in the galaxy it is. But in humans who have spent their lives fighting their own fear responses, the prefrontal override is so deeply built, so neurologically reinforced, that the pheromonal signal can't reach past it. It hits the cortex and the cortex just refuses." Ethan had stared at the diagram for a long time. "So we didn't resist by accident," he said. "No," Ryan said. "We resisted because of everything we've been through. Every terrible thing any of us ever survived and refused to break under. The Queens tried to use our biology against us, and our biology said no, because we spent our whole lives making it say no to things bigger than this." On Day 7. With the second wave pressing against 11 human skulls, and their contact list of resistant survivors now numbering 412 people spread across 19 stations and 6 colony worlds, Ryan Cole made his breakthrough. He had been working on the theory of Defiant's feedback, the idea that the pain the resistant humans felt was not just a side effect of the neural conflict, but an active output signal. The human brain, flooded with the Queen's pheromonal command and refusing it, was generating its own neurochemical response. A countersignal. Raw, unstructured, biologically incoherent from a Velshari perspective, but immensely powerful. The way white noise is powerful. Not a melody, not a message, just pure, overwhelming static. And the static had direction. It was traveling back along the same biochemical channels the Queen's signal had traveled down. "We're broadcasting back," Ryan said, and his voice had gone very quiet in the way voices go quiet when the information they carry is too large for normal volume. "Every time we refuse the signal, we don't just block it. We generate a counterpulse. We send it right back where it came from. Our resistance isn't just resistance, it's a transmission. We are transmitting the neurochemical signature of Defiance directly into the Hive network." The room was very still. "What does that do?" Ethan asked. Ryan picked up one of his diagrams. His hands were steady now, steadier than they had been in days, with the peculiar calm of someone who has moved past the point of fear and into the clear air of pure, focused purpose. "The Queen's nervous systems are the opposite of ours," he said. "They evolved for perfect order, perfect compliance, perfect signal clarity in their network. They have never in 300 million years received a transmission from a subject species that was anything other than submission data. Their network has no protocol for this, no filter. No defense." He set the diagram down. "We are sending chaos directly into a system that has never experienced chaos. And I have a theory about what happens when you do that long enough and with enough intensity." He looked at Ethan. "I think we can overload them," he said. Ethan did not respond immediately. He looked around the armory. He looked at the faces of 10 people who had been in constant pain for 7 days and had not once, not for a single hour, considered kneeling. He thought about 412 other faces on 19 other stations, all of them carrying the same grinding weight of resistance and the same refusal to put it down. Then he looked back at Ryan. "Tell me what we need to do," he said. And that was when the second wave of the Queen's pheromonal signal hit its peak, and every resistant human on Ares 7 felt, for just a fraction of a second, something they had not expected. Hesitation, not in themselves, in the signal itself. The Queens were not certain anymore. Something in their network had detected the counterpulse, and for the first time in 300 million years, the Hive Queens of the Velshari Empire felt something they did not have a name for. They would learn its name soon enough. Every species eventually did. It was called doubt. The plan Ryan Cole drew up was not elegant. There was nothing elegant about any of it. What it was desperate and precise, and built on the most fundamental truth about human beings that the Velshari Empire had spent 300 million years failing to encounter. That when humans are cornered, they do not calculate survival odds. They get creative. The Defiance Feedback Amplification Protocol, Marcus Holt called it the Scream Back Plan, and the name stuck. Because soldiers always prefer names that mean something visceral to names that mean something accurate, required 3 things. First, it required the maximum possible number of resistant humans to synchronize their neural rejection response simultaneously. Not randomly, not individually, but together in a coordinated burst. Ryan's modeling suggested that a synchronized counterpulse from even a few hundred resistant minds would hit the Hive network with enough dissonance to cause measurable degradation in the Queens. Signal clarity, not enough to break it, but enough to crack it, enough to make the Queens feel, for the first time, what it was like to receive information their neurology was not built to process. Second, it required getting the message out. Ethan and Marcus had been working the communications network in fragmentary bursts, careful to keep transmissions short enough to avoid detection. Building a web of contact across 19 resistant survivor groups. Now they needed to make one large, coordinated, utterly unsubtle broadcast. A countdown, a synchronized moment, a signal that would reach every resistant human in range at the same time. The risk was that the Queens would detect the broadcast. The risk was that they would respond before the scream back could be executed. The risk was that Ryan's model was wrong, or incomplete, or based on assumptions that would collapse when tested against the reality of 300-million-year-old alien neurochemistry. "Every plan has risk," Ethan said. When Marcus laid out the risk assessment with the meticulous thoroughness of a man who had survived 6 combat deployments, by never once pretending danger wasn't there. The question isn't whether this is risky. The question is whether doing nothing is riskier. Marcus thought about the 472 people kneeling quietly on the floors of this station. He thought about 800 million human beings, across 63 colonies, peacefully subjugated. He thought about what peacefully subjugated meant long-term, once the Queen's decided compliance was confirmed and moved to the next phase of whatever their plan actually was. "Execute," Marcus said. The third thing the plan required was the hardest. Ryan needed to make the counterpulse louder. Not just the synchronized broadcast of existing resistant minds that would crack the signal, but crack was not enough. Crack could be repaired. What Ryan needed was to amplify the Defiant's feedback to a magnitude that the Hive network couldn't absorb, couldn't filter, and couldn't recover from in any reasonable time frame. He needed to turn the scream back into something that didn't just disrupt the Queen's signal, it overwhelmed their capacity to transmit it all. "How?" Ethan asked. "Pain," Ryan said. He said it simply, clinically, the way a doctor says a hard thing because it's true, and being gentle about it doesn't make it less true. The Defiant's feedback is generated by the neural conflict between the limbic submission response and the prefrontal override. The more intense the conflict, the stronger the counterpulse. Right now, our conflict intensity is, call it a 6 out of 10, painful but sustainable. If we deliberately push into the red, if we voluntarily amplify our own resistance response, maximize the neural conflict. Accept significantly more pain than we've been absorbing, the counterpulse output goes up by a factor that my model says will be sufficient. The armory was very quiet. "You're asking us to hurt ourselves more," Marcus said. "I'm asking you to choose to feel more pain than your nervous system wants you to feel," Ryan said. Which is, technically speaking, the thing every single one of us has been doing our entire lives, just more of it, more deliberately, for about 90 seconds. Ethan looked around the room. He did not ask for a vote. He did not give a speech. He looked at each face, and what he saw looking back at him was not eagerness, and it was not fearlessness. And it was not the kind of soldier's blankness that pretends the cost of a thing doesn't exist. What he saw was something much more human than any of those things. He saw people who were afraid and were going to do it anyway. 90 seconds, he said. 90 seconds, Ryan confirmed. They had 22 hours to coordinate the broadcast. Ethan and Marcus worked the comms in rotating shifts, reaching out to every resistant contact in their network, transmitting the protocol in compressed, encrypted bursts. The response rate was not perfect. Some contacts had gone silent, some signals were too degraded to confirm receipt, but by hour 19, they had confirmed 281 resistant humans across 11 locations who had received the protocol and confirmed readiness. 281 people who had all decided, independently, across the dark spaces between stars. That 90 seconds of the worst pain of their lives was a reasonable price for what might be on the other side of it. In the final 3 hours before the countdown, Ryan Cole sat alone in the corner of the armory and finished his documentation. Every observation, every data point, every hypothesis from the past 8 days. He wrote quickly, with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that what he was documenting might be the most important scientific record in human history, or might never be read by anyone, depending on how the next 90 seconds went. He titled the document, Neural Resistance to Biochemical Submission Signals, Preliminary Findings. Author, Dr. Ryan Cole, Xenobiology Division, Colony Station, Ares 7. Date, Day 8. Then he added, at the bottom, in handwriting rather than typed text, because some things felt like they should be in a human hand rather than a machine font. We were told our defiance was a flaw. Turns out it was the whole point. At T-10 minutes, the Queen's pheromonal signal intensified. They had detected something. They didn't know what. Ryan was confident they couldn't decode the counterpulse frequency. Not yet, but 300 million years of perfect galactic dominion had given the Velshari Queens a sensitivity to disruption that was almost instinctive. Something in their network was irregular. Something in their beautiful, flawless system of submission was generating noise. The intensification of the signal hit the resistant humans on Ares 7 like a physical blow. 3 of them went down, not in submission, but in genuine physical collapse, overwhelmed, their nervous systems hitting a limit that human neurology had never been tested against before. 8 remained standing, Ethan Briggs stood at the communications console. His vision was white at the edges. His hands on the console were shaking. He could feel the signal pressing against his skull with a force that made the previous 8 days feel like a warm-up. He hit the broadcast key, sent the countdown, 60 seconds. The countdown ran in absolute silence, not the silence of people who had nothing to say. The silence of people who were using every available unit of cognitive capacity to hold themselves upright, to stay present, to keep their feet on the floor and their minds their own for 60 more seconds. 45. On 11 stations and 6 colony worlds, 278 human beings, 3 had gone dark in the last hour, stood in whatever space they had claimed and breathed and refused. 30. Ryan Cole in the corner of the armory closed his documentation and stood up. He pressed his back against the wall. He felt the Queen's amplified signal like a hand around his brain, squeezing, and he thought about every time in his life he had been afraid and had kept going anyway. Every experiment that had failed and he had started again. Every moment where the smart thing and the human thing had been different things and he had chosen the human thing. 15. Ethan Briggs looked at Marcus Holt across the communications console. Marcus looked back. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said by the simple fact of both of them still being on their feet. 10. The Queen's signal hit its maximum. It was not a signal anymore. It was a roar, a neurochemical roar that rolled through the biology of every human mind in range. A sound that existed below sound. A command that existed below thought. Pressing at the oldest and deepest and most fundamental architecture of the human animal, and screaming one word in a language that predated language. Neil 5. Ethan Briggs closed his eyes. He felt the full weight of it, not fighting it, not bracing against it. Just feeling it completely, the way you feel a current when you decide to swim against it, knowing exactly what you are up against, making your choice with full information, no illusions. No comfort. His spine was on fire, his skull felt like it was fracturing. His hands were shaking so badly he could feel the vibration of them against the console. He thought, not today. 0. 278 human beings, spread across the dark between stars, did not resist the Queen's signal. They went toward it. Ryan had explained it in the final briefing, and Ethan had not fully understood it at the time. But he understood it now in the wordless way that you understand things when your body is doing them, rather than your mind thinking about them. Resistance was passive, a wall, a blockage, a refusal to engage. What Ryan was asking them to do was different. He was asking them to reach into the conflict inside their own skulls, to grab the Queen's signal with both hands, to pour every volt of their own neural output into the contact point, and to push back with everything. Not to block it, to overwhelm it, to take the alien command that said submit and drown it in something so fundamentally, chaotically, irreducibly human that the Queen's network had no category for it. The Defiant's feedback, amplified past any level Ryan's model had predicted, because models do not fully capture what human beings do when they are fighting for everything, hit the Hive network like nothing the Velshari Empire had experienced in 300 million years. The Queens felt it. Aboard their 63 vessels, the Hive Queens of the Velshari, ancient beings who had never once, in all their vast geological span of dominion, felt anything from a subject species except the clean, satisfying data of submission, felt something arrive in their neural network that their biology had no framework for. It was not aggression. The Queens understood aggression. They had catalogued and conquered species that attacked them, species that fled, species that bargained, and species that wept. None of those responses had ever mattered. This was not aggression, this was a frequency, a signal. Complex, multi-layered, internally contradictory in ways that should have been neurologically impossible. Fear and defiance simultaneously, despair and determination at the same moment. The specific human paradox of knowing something is probably going to kill you, and deciding it doesn't matter. It arrived in the Queen's sensory network at a magnitude that their biological filtering systems were simply not designed to process. The Hive network was built for clean data, for submission signals, for the pure, simple mathematics of dominance received and acknowledged. It had no noise floor because there had never been noise. The filters that should have protected the Queen's nervous systems from signal overload had never been stress-tested, because in 300 million years, nothing had ever sent them a signal worth filtering. 278 human minds, screaming their defiance in unison back through the Queen's own biological network, hit those unfiltered nervous systems with the force of a signal they could not absorb. The Queen's network began to fail. It did not fail all at once. It failed the way complex systems always fail. At the edges first, the distant relays degrading, the outer connections dropping, the signal clarity in the pheromonal broadcast becoming inconsistent. Then fragmented, then simply absent. On the colony worlds, humans who had been kneeling quietly for 8 days suddenly lifted their heads, blinking. With expressions of people waking from a very deep sleep into a world they did not quite recognize yet. Aboard Ares 7, Ethan Briggs felt the Queen's signal flicker, then stutter. Then drop suddenly and completely like a power outage, the roaring pressure in his skull replaced by a silence so absolute it was almost its own kind of pain. He opened his eyes. Marcus was still standing. Ryan was still standing. 6 of the 8 were still on their feet. One had slid down the wall and was sitting on the floor, conscious but spent. One was kneeling, not in submission, but because his legs had simply stopped working, and he was holding his own head in both hands, breathing. They had done it. And then the communications board lit up with something none of them had expected. An incoming signal from the Queen-class vessel, not pheromonal, not biological. A direct, targeted transmission, using human communication technology, translated through a matrix that was clearly functioning on much more limited capacity than it had been an hour ago. The translation was imperfect, jagged, some words dropped, others doubled, but the meaning was unmistakable. How just that? One word, not a demand, not a threat. Not the language of a conqueror addressing a conquered species. A question. Ethan stared at the communication board for a long moment. Then he sat down, and he thought about what to say to a 300-million-year-old alien empire that had just discovered, for the first time in its existence, that the universe contained something it did not understand. He thought about it for 11 seconds. Then he leaned forward and said one sentence, clear, simple, in the voice of a man who had been in pain for 8 straight days and was still standing into the open channel. We spent 200,000 years learning to say no to things that scared us. You were just the latest thing on the list. The channel was silent for a very long time. And then, somewhere inside the Hive network, in the ancient neural architecture of beings who had built an empire on the assumption that the universe was divided cleanly into the dominant and the submissive, something began to change. 6 months after day 0, a xenobiologist named Dr. Ryan Cole stood in front of the United Human Colonies Assembly and delivered a testimony that lasted 4 hours, covered 37 distinct scientific disciplines, and ended with a standing ovation from 212 planetary representatives who had spent the opening months of that year on their knees. He titled his testimony, The Velshari Reconfiguration and What It Means for the Future of Humanity. The reconfiguration had not been instantaneous. It had been gradual, strange, and in the early weeks, deeply alarming to everyone who did not understand what they were watching. In the immediate aftermath of the scream back, the Queen's pheromonal network had remained offline for 11 days. During those 11 days, humanity had woken up disoriented, physically weakened. Emotionally raw in the way people are when they have lost a large block of time, and had immediately done the most human thing possible. They had started asking questions. Commander Ethan Briggs, coordinating from Ares 7, had spent those 11 days in a communication marathon, working with resistant survivor groups across the network to build a coherent picture of what had happened, what the Queen's next move was likely to be, and how to explain to 800 million people that they had been chemically subdued by an alien empire, and were currently in a window of unclear duration during which that empire was experiencing what appeared to be an unprecedented neurological crisis. The Queen's next move had not been what anyone expected. When the pheromonal network came back online on day 12, it was different, quieter. The broad-spectrum submission signal was gone. In its place was something much more localized, fragmented transmissions, clearly exploratory in nature. As though the Queens were testing the edges of their own broadcasting capacity, with extreme caution. Ryan described it as the neurochemical equivalent of a person who has been hit by a car, testing their own limbs to see what still works. And then, on day 14, came the first Queen-class vessel to respond to a human hailing signal. The vessel that responded was the flagship, the largest of the 63, orbiting the primary human colony world of New Cascadia at a distance that was now clearly non-threatening. Its weapons systems offline, its biological broadcasting arrays at minimal power. When the channel opened, the translation matrix that came through was noticeably degraded compared to the crisp, clinical communication system the Velshari were known for across the galaxy. Something in their network's architecture had been fundamentally altered. The Queen who spoke, and it was unmistakably a Queen, the processing power behind the transmission too vast and ancient for anything lesser, did not issue commands. She asked for a meeting. The meeting took 3 weeks to arrange and involved more diplomatic infrastructure improvised under pressure than anything humanity had attempted in its history. Ryan Cole was present. Ethan Briggs was present. Admiral James Caldwell was present, looking considerably older than the last time Ethan had seen his face on a display. The Queen who attended the meeting communicated through a biological intermediary, a drone unit, physically present, that served as a translation interface for the Queen's neural broadcast. The drone's movements were oddly hesitant, as though operating on instructions that kept revising themselves in real time. The first thing the Queen communicated, through the drone and the matrix and the careful work of 12 linguists and 2 xenobiologists who had been speed-briefed on everything Ryan knew, was not an apology. It was not an explanation. It was a confirmation. Your neural pattern altered our reception architecture. This was not reversible. Ryan had nodded slowly. He had suspected as much. The Defiant's feedback, transmitted directly into the Queen's unfiltered biological network at amplified magnitude, had not simply disrupted the Hive network's signal clarity. It had done something more fundamental. The Queen's nervous systems, exquisitely sensitive and completely undefended, had absorbed the human counterpulse not just as noise but as data and their neurological architecture. In attempting to process and categorize that data, had begun to reorganize itself around the pattern. The human pattern of defiance, the human pattern of internal conflict, the human paradox of an organism that feels submission and refuses it. The Queen's neurological architecture, 300 million years of evolutionary refinement aimed at perfect dominance and perfect order, had no framework for that pattern. And so, in the way that any sufficiently complex system responds to information it cannot categorize, it had begun to build one. It was still building. In the 6 months since day 0, the 63 Queen-class vessels had settled into stable orbits around human colony worlds, not as conquerors, not as diplomats exactly, but as something without a clear prior category. The Queen's pheromonal broadcasting capacity had not recovered. The broad-spectrum submission signal remained offline, and the xenobiologists who were now working in cautious, careful collaboration with Velshari biological researchers suspected it would never fully return, not because the mechanism was damaged, but because the mechanism was being overwritten by new architecture that had different priorities. What those new priorities were was still being mapped. What was clear was the behavior. The 63 vessels had begun responding to human requests, not all requests. Not without what appeared to be internal deliberation among the Queen collective. But when human colonies needed heavy-lift capability for construction, the Queen-class vessels provided it. When a distant human research outpost reported a structural emergency, the nearest vessel was there in hours. When a syndicate freighter convoy attempted to move through human space without authorization and ignored the human patrol response, it took exactly one appearance by a Queen-class vessel at standard communications range to produce instant compliance. The galaxy, it turned out, still remembered what the Velshari Queens had been before day 0, and the galaxy's memory was very useful. Humanity had not planned any of this. There had been no strategic blueprint, for turning apex alien predators into the most formidable defense and labor force in the known galaxy. There had been no committee, no policy paper, no diplomatic initiative. There had been a xenobiologist in an armory with a dying data pad and a theory that human stubbornness might be loud enough to break something ancient and enormous. He had been right. About most of it. At the assembly, in the final minutes of his testimony, Ryan Cole set down his prepared notes and spoke without them. He did this because what he wanted to say at the end was not a scientific finding. It was something else. "We have spent 6 months trying to understand what we did and what it means," he said. "And I want to offer one framing that I think is important. We did not win because we were stronger than the Velshari. We did not win because we were smarter or better armed or better prepared. We were none of those things. We won because when the most powerful biological weapon ever developed in the history of this galaxy told us to stop being human, we couldn't. Not because we had a strategy. Because being human, the arguing with our own instincts, the choosing fear and going forward anyway, the stubborn, irrational, neurologically expensive refusal to simply comply with what the universe is telling us to do, is not a behavior we can turn off. It is what we are." He paused. The Queens read that pattern and they could not put it down either. It rewrote them not because defiance is magic, but because defiance at sufficient intensity, consistently applied over time, changes the environment around it. It always has. It always will. The applause started before he finished the sentence. On the observation deck of Ares 7, that same evening, Commander Ethan Briggs stood and watched a Queen-class vessel moving in slow, deliberate orbit around Proxima Centauri b. Its running lights casting long blue shadows across the planetary cloud cover below. It was the same ship that had been there on the morning 8 months ago when the sensors had first lit up and Derek Walsh had gone pale. It was still vast. It was still ancient. It was still, in every physical sense, one of the most formidable constructs in the known galaxy. But it was responding to a maintenance request from the new Cascadia orbital platform. And it was doing so with what the translation matrix rendered as something functionally equivalent to willingness. Marcus Holt came and stood beside him. They watched in companionable silence for a while. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Marcus said eventually. "What?" "That second wave, day 7. When we felt the Queens hesitate." Marcus folded his arms. "That was the moment. They felt the counterpulse and something in them went, wait, what is this?" "That was the moment the whole thing started to tip." Ethan nodded. "Doubt," he said. "Doubt," Marcus agreed. 300 million years and they'd never doubted anything. Then 11 humans with headaches sent them something they didn't have a word for. He was quiet for a moment. "Kind of makes you think about all the other empires, all the other species that knelt. What would have happened if any of them had held on just a little longer?" Ethan thought about that. He thought about the vast, old silence of the galaxy, and all the species out there who had learned the same lesson the hard way, in the same direction, that the universe rewarded compliance. That dominance was permanent, that once something ancient and powerful told you to kneel, the sensible response was to kneel. And he thought about the specific, peculiar, slightly exhausting, deeply expensive human inability to learn that lesson. "They had the wrong data," Ethan said finally. "The whole galaxy had the wrong data. They thought compliance was survival. Turns out survival is refusing to let anything, including the oldest empire in the known galaxy, tell you what you are." Marcus considered this. "You should put that on a plaque," he said. "Ryan already did," Ethan said. "It's on the armory door." Marcus almost smiled. Below them, the Queen-class vessel completed its orbit and began its next pass, vast and patient and changed. Moving through the dark in service of the species that had refused to kneel, and in doing so, had rewritten the only code that mattered. If you made it this far, you already know you're the kind of person who doesn't quit either. Drop a comment below and tell us, what was the moment in this story that hit you hardest? Share this with someone who needs to hear that stubbornness is a superpower. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales, because this is just the beginning of the stories we have to tell. The galaxy is large, and humanity is just getting started.